wash my wounds, shatter, scrape, break, bad, another miscarriage.
Thank you. The central questions defining the conversation for today in particular have to do with the current sort of state of commercial hip hop in the US. So those are already two caveats. Commercial hip hop in the US, not hip hop in the universe of all types everywhere, whether commercialized or not. But mainstream commercial hip hop in the US, and the kinds of racial storytelling that both go on in commercial hip hop in the US now, and what that says about this thing that people are now calling the Obama era. So the central questions for today in my presentation are: one, what role can hip hop today play in telling stories about communities that are dispossessed? And I'm going to make an argument that mainstream commercial hip hop no longer does that job, primarily. And the second is, can hip hop carry this torch of popular music that has created meaningful cross-racial imagination, conversation, and action? And the last question for today is, what are the factors that impede or expand hip hop's social justice potential in this age, in this early part of the 21st century, in this mass-mediated cultural space, and in this era that some people call the Obama era? So I find, as I give these talks, that it's very important to me to lay out what happened in hip-hop the previous 30 years. Okay, so hip-hop exists 30 years, nearly. About 1972, 3, 4, but mostly 75 forward, and not on the radio at all in any way, shape, or form until the mid-1980s. And then not en masse on the radio. There was no hip-hop stations. It was a strange underground thing for a very long time, not really until the late 1980s that you begin to see it take place. And there's still dramatic resistance to it as late as the late 1980s. Okay, so the first and most important thing is that hip-hop is not without cultural roots that are deeper than hip-hop itself. Hip-hop grows not out of a tree in Brooklyn or out of the imagination of a few, but out of a set of traditions and ways of approaching music and sound and rhythm that are very common in the African diaspora. It's not limited to people of African descent as creative people. People from all over the world obviously can participate, but the aesthetics, which is a way of saying what are the artistic priorities of hip hop, grow almost entirely out of the Afro-inspired Spanish-speaking Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, and African-American communities, all of whom come together in Harlem, in the Bronx, in New York City in the 1970s. So the poetic form, the use of polyrhythms, the incredibly bass-heavy beats that hip-hop redefined in the construction of music come from a combination of Jamaican, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, African-American, and other groups, but they were the primary innovators of hip-hop in the early days. One of the things that is also significant from the storytelling side is the use of long-form storytelling. In the US, it's known as toasts, and mostly toasts and toasting. But Jamaicans also have toasting, but it's slightly different. But this notion of telling stories from a single position, but in a collective narrative. So if I were to tell a story, I would tell a story that you all would know if we were all part of this same community, but the way I tell it is where my innovation comes from. It's how you treat the object that your originality lies, right? Your originality doesn't lie in pretending you invented something entirely from scratch. Think of the blues. A lot of people know many, many lyrics and many songs in the blues. They didn't belong to any one person. They were shared. People would sing them. They'd know the general tune. They'd know certain lyrics. The idea would be, what are you bringing to the table when you perform? Okay, so this is a very important piece because it should, if you know hip hop pretty well, it should signal why sampling was not in any way an odd thing to do, because it was a set of musical sounds that you put into new relationship, pieces of different songs you put together like a collage to make something new. So the originality had to do with how did you treat this James Brown riff? How did you treat this Coltrane horn section, which, for example, Public Enemy's Bomb Squad producers embedded John Coltrane samples played backwards in another key to create familiarity and chaos at the same time. Now, why I spent time on this up front is because one of the most troubling things to have happened in our international conversation about hip hop is to imagine that because the world can share it, it has no origins. This is a terrible fiction, and it's a fiction that happens to African American and Black diasporic culture all the time. And I think it's extremely important that we, on the one hand, embrace whatever music and culture the world brings us, but we do it with the requisite level of respect around the aesthetic and historical circumstances that brought it into existence. Black music has changed the face of Western music forever, dramatically over the past several hundred years, and it often does not get its requisite due as an aesthetic influence. All of these social service programs that poor and working communities desperately need, like after-school programs, daycare centers, recreation centers after school because your parents are working, ridiculous numbers of jobs and hours, and who's got time for a nanny to wait for you at home? So you need community centers. All of these are completely unfunded as well, and so there's no place for people to go. So hip hop is an incredible collision of the creativity of this diasporic world that I described initially, and this profoundly evacuated the disaccumulation of social and cultural resources and outlets in the city at the same time, and the public streets become the playground and the community centers for a whole generation. So all of the original music and breakdancing and beats construction and rhyming took place on the street. Storytelling in hip hop for the first 10 to 15 years is a diverse arrangement of stories. It's got wide ranges of narrative and creativity. It's not necessarily always what I'd call, politically progressive. I'm not suggesting that it met our standards for that. No vernacular culture does. Neither does toasting. Neither do any sort of street rhymes. Yes, there were vulgar narratives. There were sexist narratives sometimes. There were aggressive narratives. I don't have a Pollyanna view. I recall them, and I could listen to them, and they have all of that. But they had all of that inside of a larger context in which the form was an interpersonal practice. The in-depth storytelling of hip-hop was an incredible element that changed the way young people felt they could control popular music. Up until this point, most popular music followed a kind of formulaic process whereby very limited verse would tell a very simplistic story that resolved itself fairly quickly and easily. That's mostly how popular music up to hip-hop worked. It didn't matter if it was country, it didn't matter if it was rhythm and blues. It's not the genre that's at stake here, it's just the way the formalization of popular music as a commodity emerged. So this sense of long-form storytelling transforms a community that largely was left not only abandoned, but mistreated and economically, intentionally disenfranchised. The most important thing that I want to point out is that while there was a kind of ghetto framework for some of the narratives, the idea of a kind of street culture, a ghetto or gangster framework, yes, you had artists that participated and understood themselves that way, but the genre as a whole was not limited to that. And singularly importantly, you had women involved in much of hip-hop for the first 20 years. Not at the heart and center in the same numbers, but you had substantial young women participating in hip-hop in all parts of it. A lot of different things happened, but for today, there are two things that happen. One is the incredible hyper-commercialization, the marketing, the realization that hip-hop is profitable as a musical form. Yes, it had become a record. Yes, people had started, selling it and having small individual labels participating in distributing it. But when it gets clear, which is the mid to late 1990s, but mostly the mid, really with West Coast, when West Coast gangster rap becomes incredibly popular among white middle class consumers and gangster rap goes pop charts, top 10, the whole industry says, oh wait, hold on a second. We thought this was a niche music, but now we see it's a bread and butter music. and the collision of those two forces on the one hand come together to make hip hop incredibly profitable, and for the industry to begin to invest in promoting, distributing, and marketing hip hop as a genre that is not just for some small communities in poor, marginal neighborhoods in different cities, but a music for the mainstream. And the second thing is what happens around hip hop, which is what happens to black and brown youth in this period, what happens in their communities. Okay, so now we're moving forward to middle 1990s into the 2000s, which is a dramatic change when the commercialization of hip hop really takes off, when you're looking at the emergence of moguls and, you know, people like Russell Simmons and P. Diddy and Jay-Z and, you know, a massive, you know, marketing apparatus with major money. Okay, so hip hop becomes highly successful, and in the process, the most ironic and disturbing thing happens. So, if hip hop started like here, and it was just going to take up this space, now hip hop stays taking up this whole board, right? So, naturally, you would think this would mean that all of the expanded ways of storytelling would expand further. Because look, you have more panels, more places to tell stories, more need to tell stories. You know how it is on TV now. You've got, what, 200 cable channels, so they have to make a channel out of fishing for one type of fish. You know, I'm like, can't y'all fish for a few types of fish on the... Nope, 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 we're just one type of fish. You know, we just get niche, niche, niche. What happens in hip hop is the more market success it has, the narrower the images and stories become. It is an extraordinary contraction of storytelling and images and ideas at the moment of its greatest market expansion. But the main thing I want to talk about now is what images and ideas the music cohered around. And I invented this phrase, which I'm ambivalent about. I mostly still like it. But it's called the gangster, pimp, hoe, trinity. And it's a trinity because it's a triangle, that's one thing. But then it's also kind of almost a religion in the sense that authenticity in hip hop, being real, being true to the game, is to be one of those three things. And as you can likely imagine, while women can be gangster and while women can be pimps, they are largely relegated to the third point of that triangle. So masculinity and manhood get attached to the ideology of street cultural behavior, which is not only in fundamental terms extra legal, that's why it's street culture, it's outside the law intentionally, but it's also about celebrating what were the codes of manhood that had to do with dominance, which was largely about hand-to-hand combat or gun-to-gun combat or drug-to-drug combat, regional conflicts, elevating the value of a street ideology of manhood. Not the only kind of black and Latino manhood in the United States, but the only one that was legitimate in the context of commercial hip hop. So why does this happen? Now this is where it gets a little bit uncomfortable. The market didn't produce this alone because they were following consumption. Their point is sales. They're interested in sales that don't challenge the status quo. They do have some investment in, you can't say F the police and not eventually have the FBI start calling your record label, which is what happened. But as long as you don't mess with that too much, their main goal as an industry is to promote and sell. Sell, sell, sell. That's all records are. That's all artists are vehicles for selling not just music, but sneakers and alcohol and everything else that young people might want. So what happens? These images of this trinity mirror almost identically 300 years of racialized stereotyping about black people. There are only 3 or 4 central tropes and ideas and images that have defined racist ideas about black people. One is that they're violent. 2 is that they're hypersexual. And because they're hypersexual and violent, they're generally criminal. So because you can't really be a morally upstanding person, be violent and hypersexual and not somehow get caught up in illegal activity. So criminality is a kind of logical outgrowth of this. Excessive, sort of excess either in the form of sexuality, excess in the form of the type of violence, but emotionally excessive, volatile, unpredictable, and stylistically excessive. Even years earlier, when I was writing my first book on hip hop, I spent time on music video sets, and you would have cats who bore no resemblance to the person that was about to show up on the screen. They would call their moms. Oh, okay, you're gonna make spaghetti tonight? I love spaghetti. You know, oh, okay, I'll get my little brother. I'll pick him up. Then they get in front of the camera. You know, I'm killing bitches. I'd be like, you're doing what? I'm like, I thought you were having spaghetti and picking up your little brother. All right, so just that was before. Right? I'm talking about before. So then when this becomes the only way to make money, not just one way, everybody's a criminal, everybody's selling crack, everybody's getting shot up, and these aren't just byproducts, these are the narratives. This is what makes you famous. This is what makes you authentic. This is what keeping it real begins to look like. And frankly, this is about, honestly, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna have to hit you kind of hard with it. You know, I love you, but it's about racist white ideology that drives desire. That is to say, we have ended the era of Jim Crow, but we have not unpacked how much the expectations are that black people perform this to be accepted, to be consumed. So this is about 70% of all of the consumption of hip hop in the US is not by African Americans, but by mostly whites and mostly males, I might point out, between the ages of 12 and 30. So the question isn't just about black behavior, it's also about why does everybody else want to listen and look at this conception? There's a lot of interesting work on this area of it because it's such a significant part of the music. But what happens around hip hop, so now this is what happened to hip hop, what happens around hip hop is incredible, both joblessness, evacuation of resources, much more severe than what was happening in the 70s, and the development of the prison industrial complex. So the stop and frisk programs that in New York that there's been a lot of fracas over, where they have arrested black males between the ages of, I think it's something like 16 and 25, more times than the number of black males between the ages of 16 and 25. So that means they've gone around and already just stopped and frisked the same cats over again. Now if you frisk every single young person of color, you're not deciding that it's because they're behaving a certain way. You've just decided that they're a certain age and a certain race and a certain gender, and your job is to harass them, to put them in the system. The prison industrial complex is an incredible system of complete re-containment and marginality and permanent criminalization of a whole class and race and gender of people. 40% of the people in prison today are African American, even though African Americans make up 13%. Mostly on, although yes, there are violent criminals of all backgrounds and cats who are trying to shoot everybody up. I'm all for keeping them at bay somehow. Certainly keep the guns away. But most are in these long sentences, illegitimately long sentences for very small infractions with small quantities of drugs, whether they're personal use marijuana or small amounts of other drugs, whatever they happen to be, or even petty drug dealing, tiny, small infractions. This massive criminalization project, there's several great books on this. The easiest to find and the most accessible is Michelle Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow. It's an amazing book. If you're interested in the prison industrial complex and these issues, it's a great read, very straightforward. But what happens then is that you start criminalizing a population and the music gets even more intensely involved in this criminal narrative. Because of course young people are experiencing it. So the fantasy, the historical fantasy, the social conditions, and the lived experience it produces, they form an unholy bond that completely reframes the narratives of hip hop. What then is the role of hip hop today, right? Because if this is what's happened and these are the conditions people are facing, how can it be that it's all about this trinity with all of this criminalization and yet no political outcry, no public discussion? You would think that after this extraordinary attack on young people and the joblessness, which the jobless rates for young non-white males, adolescent through 20s, is just staggering, sometimes 30, 40, 50% in major cities. In Detroit, it's higher than that. So we're not talking, forget 13, they get all worked up. Oh, we're at 13%, oh, we're at 9%. Oh, really? It would be like Christmas if these communities had a 13% or 9% unemployment rate. That means 80%, 90% would have jobs. I mean, people, would just be thrilled. But where is the political content? What happened to the critical engagement of these issues in mainstream hip hop? It completely disappears. And it's not random that it disappears, because that political content disrupts the comfortable consumption of ultimately what I want to call this kind of post-racial, colorblind ideology that on the surface, this colorblind ideology produces the idea that we're all together and we don't see race and we're all friends and everything's good, but the structural conditions are so substantially and intentionally and consistently producing racial hierarchies that cannot be overcome by personal behavior. They're producing racial hierarchies that cannot be overcome by individual personal behavior, and yet we feign inability to see, hear, or know about it. So anything that interrupts that fiction is not interesting to consume. It's either depressing or it makes you self-reflect, and who wants to deal with that? I want to be entertained by the ghetto. I'm just being honest. Right? I want to have a good time and party like whoever it is I'm listening to. I don't want to grapple with the actual conditions and circumstances. And so, of course, what do the artists do? The artists who want to make money because it's a massive industry and want to stay on top, they're not going to fight with that, because to fight with that is to relegate oneself to the margins. You don't break big and stay big talking about that. Not now. It's not that there are not conditions. It's not that there are not circumstances, and I'm not suggesting it all be political. I'm just saying there's no discussion whatsoever. The Arab Spring was not only the result of just people's general outrage, but through the creative development of local Arab and Egyptian MCs who narrated the lived experience of young people in ways that brought communities of people together. It's not that hip-hop made it happen, but hip-hop was a tremendous vehicle for storytelling and connectivity. It's not the only place. Brazilian hip-hop is another great example of that. Different types of African hip-hop, not all are the same. Nigerian, for example, is not so much, but Senegalese is a little bit more so on the political side. So you see this all over the place, in places big and small, multiracial, to different degrees. And so the role for what hip-hop can do for the dispossessed is extraordinary today. It's not that it's impossible. It's there, it's everywhere, and in fact, I'm also making the case that there are hints of it in the mainstream, and then there are very much sort of local scenes, educationally focused hip-hop, community center focused hip-hop all around the US that are trying to create this space for a wide range of ideas and narrative power, because the form is incredibly flexible. The two things that I've talked about, this denial of structural racism and mass corporate control of the expressive forms, these two things have had a profound impact on stifling the creative center of commercial hip-hop. And so the social potential in the age of Obama has everything to do with challenging those two elements. That is to say that mass market control of young people's culture is a formula for disaster. It doesn't matter what the culture's about. Market ideology and market behavior is about profiting, not interrogating and challenging. They don't say, hey, we should really promote anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic music, or we should just at least create diversity in here so that there is a space of challenge, which is what you would have in real life, right? But they're not interested in that. They're like, look, this is a short-term project. They're not trying to have a 30-year project for saving hip-hop or developing an art form across a century like jazz. They have no interest in that. They're interested in what sells, how much does it sell, and how long can I make it sell as high as possible. And with that agenda, the most base conceptions of racial ideology have driven the framework, and sexual and gender ideology. So the two key ways to deal with the impediments of social potential in the age of Obama is, again, as I said, to really attack the aggressive denial of structural racism. And why age of Obama, and this, I just want to take 2 minutes on this and then I'm going to wrap up, is that I've been I was very moved in many ways by Obama's campaign initially running for office, and I was incredibly depressed by the ways in which race had to fall away from any moment during the presidency, even when it matters so much. It's not all or nothing. It's not like you talk about black people and then nobody else exists. I mean, it's just like, so it's like we had to be non-existent, even as there were issues that were distinctive and specific and important and exaggeratedly happening. We had to be non-existent so that he could stay president, basically. That is, whether that's about him or not is not my issue here today. But I do think what it is for certain also about is the terms of belonging in this historical moment. What kinds of blackness are acceptable to us? There's a profound discomfort with the realities of structural inequality, so the people who raise it are themselves called racists. You've seen this happen over and over in mass media. You're playing the race card. Like, I'm not playing cards at all. You know what I'm saying? I don't play cards. I'm not playing any games. These are the facts. Now, I don't want these facts to be here either, and I want us all to work together. I'm not anti-white or a person who's, I'm taking up the embodiment here of the person who's raising it. I'm anti-racist. So it's not, whoever wants to choose to be racist, that's their choice. Or to identify or to deny the power of racial inequality and the investment in housing and jobs and social services and educational hoarding that reproduces this inequality. This is not a legacy, a little bit of leftover from the 60s. This is the reproduction of new modes of inequality that we should be able to talk about. Otherwise, we can't fix it. You tell me what it is we're going to fix if we can't talk about it. Put anything in the box. If I tell you I can't see it and it's not happening, I want to know then what the next step is for fixing that. That's the box that the question of today's post-civil rights era racial inequality we're in. And young people are hamstrung. They see it of all backgrounds. They see it. I believe in I have a tremendous faith in human beings. I think, yes, there's some rabid crazies in every group, and that's fine. But there are most people, if they had all the facts about what I'm talking about, would have to ask some fundamental questions. It would mean making some people uncomfortable, but it wouldn't mean rejecting a multiracial democracy by any stretch. The way in which we're being asked to deny this encourages the very silences that commercialized hip-hop is not only facing, but changes our relationship to consuming blackness. So this is this massive contradiction. We're consuming all of these hyper-stereotypical images of black people for great profit, but we don't want to talk about any of the social conditions and circumstances around it. We're not interested. That's a very troubling context. There are three things that I think can get us out of this bind. And I believe very strongly in all three of these things, and I know all of you have the power to participate in that, but they do require some action, they require some agency, they require some recognition that something has to change, that this isn't helpful to us. The three are spirit, I'm gonna talk about them in a minute, spirit, space, and knowledge. Spirit, space, and knowledge. I'm gonna start with knowledge. You cannot understand the conditions that we face as a nation or as a world today if you don't want to just confront various modes of structural inequality. Structural inequality is not personal behavior. It's a set of policies and ideas that work together to reproduce major group-based inequality. So if you say you have a lot of Muslim friends, right, but the behavior of, say, the police in your town harass them, put them in jail, mistreat them, they can't get jobs. It doesn't matter that you have a few Muslim friends. You can have all the friends you want. That doesn't change the reality. Okay, do you see the difference? This isn't about bigotry or about individual belief, since most people in America consistently say they believe in racial equality. But when we say, well, we don't have it, they are like, well, I don't know what you want from me. I believe in it. But so, knowledge, that means we have to work hard to tell the truth. Tell the truth about systemic structural inequalities. They destroy democracy, they create conflict, hoarding resources, whether by class, hoarding power, and influence by gender and race, do not help us create a safe and peaceful and egalitarian democracy by any stretch. It's a major impediment. Cross-racial groups have been central to every major social justice activism in the world, in the United States that is, I mean, in forever pretty much, but especially in the last 100 years. African Americans are primary civil rights movement, but many other groups of people participated. That is to say, everybody has a role in this project. This is not a one or another. Second is spirit. And in the end of Hip Hop Wars, I have this phrase where I'm basically suggesting a number of things, and one of them is, we live in a market economy. That we're not changing anytime soon. But we have to stop letting the market economy live in us. That is to say, we cannot treat each other like commodities, that you're valuable because you can do X for me, and what you make me look like. The whole male-female dynamic in the vast majority of hip-hop video, not all, but the vast majority is, women are objects to be consumed so that they make the man in the video look good, feel good, and have more power. That's a market economy logic, an exchange value of human beings. We can't change the fact that we live in a market economy, but we have to learn to see each other and care about each other seriously and to elevate the spaces that make that possible. Right? That is to say that mass cultural attitudes are inflecting the stories we tell about each other, not just where we hear the stories. And the third thing is space. That is to say, develop and protect spaces for creativity and newness, that are not driven primarily by profit, where you're really adamant about what ways you're telling stories and how they make communities feel and who your friends are and why. In other words, develop and sustain those creative spaces, because all the new ideas that we've had come from dream space, come from imagination, come from imagining new things and saying, well, what if, and what about this, and how do these things connect, and what are the ways in which what I'm doing contributes to a better place, a more just world in some way or another, whether this much so or this much so. I'm not making a case we have to get on board 24/7. But recognizing that commercialized spaces are not the equivalent of every space you occupy. It's very hard to see right now that that's the case, but it is. You have a world that is outside of the market, but the market is perpetually encroaching on that space, and it's very hard to cultivate it. And I want to end on saying that that the creation of those spaces do not come from everybody being on board immediately in full throttle terms. Martin King made this fabulous assessment, which I think is entirely true now, and that is that massive change happens from a creative minority. It only takes a small percentage of any given society. Yes, some of them have to be change makers, but it takes a very small percentage. And so I want you to take really seriously how powerful you can be, not just as consumers, but as non-consumers, as alternative actors who create space for yourselves, for each other, for young people, help old people get in line, because we're not all that helpful sometimes either. And really understand yourselves as agents of change, because this isn't about, toppling some magical system in the future, but it is about transforming rather quickly our engagement with it. And I think a great deal is at stake, really much more than any musical form. It is really about how we care about each other and frankly, what world we want to live in. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very, very much.
All of the things about race and